Hello, students. The last change from the late 19th century that we're going to examine is the arrival of the so-called new immigrants. And this term is generally applied to the massive influx of immigration to the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century from countries in Southern and Eastern Europe, particularly Italy, Greece, Poland, and Russia. But this time period will also see a significant number of migrants from China and Mexico. Now, to give you an idea of how much of a change this immigration is for the U.S., at the end of the Civil War, about 1% of all of the people who immigrated to the U.S. came from Southern and Eastern Europe. By the beginning of World War I, it was a full 70%. New York City, in the early 1900s, 50% of the population was either immigrants or the children of immigrants. When we examine migrations of people, you can look at the reasons for migration into one of two broad categories, either push factors or pull factors. Push factors are reasons that people leave their home country to move somewhere else. And generally, you don't see people deciding to move out of their country if everything's going well for them and they're very prosperous and wealthy. So there's usually something bad going on that is forcing people to have to leave their homeland and seek out a new place to live. In this time period, there were a lot of land reforms as well as some international crop price drops or dips that were affecting farmers in Mexico, China, and Poland and driving a lot of the immigration from there. In addition, there are repeated wars and revolutions in Europe and China, and these things are going to lead to a lot of destruction as well as famine and poverty for many of the poorer people in those countries. In addition, Russian Jews in particular faced a lot of religious persecution in their homeland and were trying to escape that. The other factors are pull factors. Pull factors are reasons that people will come to the country to which they are migrating. So in this case, the United States. So what were some of the reasons that people were attracted to the United States as a new homeland? For one, there are the religious and political freedoms that the United States enshrined in its Constitution. And while these rights were seen as much more limited in this time period, they were still much greater than in other nations. And the promise of those freedoms drew a lot of people to the U.S. In addition, there was the opportunity for free land via the Homestead Act. Now, this would, of course, require that the immigrants have the money to be able to get to the West once they arrived in the U.S., but many railroad companies actually offered special rates to bring people out west who had immigrated to the United States, particularly European immigrants, because those land grants that they had gotten from the government, many of them had built businesses on there, and they needed people out west to support those businesses. Chain migration plays a factor too. If you have a relative or a friend already living in America, they will be able to help you to adjust to the United States and makes the United States a much more desirable place to live. But the number one reason for movement of any sort, whether it's immigration from one country to another or migration within a country, is going to be jobs. And the United States had a vastly growing economy at the time, and it needed workers. So railroads, mines, and especially factories offered a lot of work that the immigrants knew they could use to get themselves set up in their new land. Once immigrants had made the difficult decision to leave their homeland and move to a completely different country, they faced even more difficulties in arriving in the United States and getting along once they had gotten here. As you can imagine from examining the various push factors that drove immigrants to leave their home countries, many of them were not financially well off. In fact, some were so poor that they were arriving in the United States with the clothes on their back and whatever they could fit into a bag, and that was about it. Passage over for these poor immigrants was oftentimes in steerage, and steerage is basically the cheapest and worst accommodations on a ship. It's usually down in the very bowels of the ship, which means there's very little ventilation, very little light. It's very crowded. There is no privacy, as you can see from this depiction of Chinese immigrants crossing the Pacific Ocean to the United States. And if there was poor weather, you couldn't even get up on deck and get some fresh air. As you might imagine, if somebody were to be sick when they got on board, it would spread very quickly through steerage. And there were many immigrants who got sick, and some even died on the passage over. Once they arrived, immigrants had to be processed before they would be allowed into the United States. These boys here are European immigrants who are being processed at one of the most famous of these processing places, which is Ellis Island in New York. When they arrived, they would have to prove that they were healthy, and also that either they had money, some sort of skill that they could get a job with, or a sponsor. Now, as we've seen, most of these immigrants were not very well off. So many of them were arriving with a sponsor, oftentimes an industrialist who was looking for work in a factory, or a mine company owner who was looking for workers there, and had actually advertised in the home country for workers to attract them to the United States. Now, Ellis Island was a bit intimidating, but usually most immigrants were processed and let into the country within a couple of hours. On the other side of the country, on the west coast, the main processing point was Angel Island near San Francisco. And this is where many of the Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States. Chinese immigrants were treated much more poorly than the European immigrants. They had to prove that they were either a citizen of the United States or that they had family in the United States who could take care of them. And the workers at this processing facility for the Chinese oftentimes assumed that they were lying. And so they could be detained for weeks or even months in essentially jail cells on Angel Island. And oftentimes they would then just be deported after all of that. In this editorial cartoon from a satirical magazine, Puck, we see the rejection many immigrants faced when they arrived in the United States. Now, the cartoonist in this case is actually lampooning the men who are rejecting him because they themselves are the immigrants or sons of immigrants from the early 19th century, the so-called old immigrants who seem to have forgotten their roots. But many immigrants found themselves to be strangers in a strange land. They arrived in the United States needing to find jobs and housing with little understanding of American culture and customs, and many of them very little understanding of English as well. To help immigrants to adapt to American society, many of the immigrants who had come before them formed fraternal orders to help assist in finding jobs and housing. So there would be Italian fraternal orders that helped new Italian immigrants coming to the United States, Polish, Irish, etc. In addition, American reformers called progressives, whom we'll learn more about in topic 3, were part of what was called the Americanization movement. And this was actually applied not just to the immigrants, but also to the Native Americans. We'll learn more about that in the next topic. But the idea was to assist the immigrants arriving and learning English and American customs by setting up things called settlement houses, which were sort of centers for immigrants to learn about America in the big cities like New York and Chicago. Now, part of the problem with this, though, was this attempt to sort of suppress the native culture of the immigrants in favor of a sort of generic American culture, which from the perspective of the progressives, American culture was really white Protestant American culture. Nativism is this fear of immigrants, this very anti-immigrant sentiment. It was pretty rampant in the late 19th, early 20th century in response to the massive influx of immigrants, just as nativism is pretty strong in America today. In this editorial cartoon, this is a nativist cartoon depicting Catholic bishops as alligators arriving on America's shore and threatening America's school children. This reflects a very strong anti-Catholic sentiment in America at the time, because there was this fear that Catholics would be loyal to the church and the Pope above the United States, and that they would bring their teachings of the Bible and force it into American public schools. Of course, all this is hyperbolic nonsense, and none of that occurred. There was also a very strong anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling among nativists as well. And of course, they also resorted to the old chestnut of they'll take your jobs. The fear here was that poor immigrants would be willing to work for lower wages, and Americans would lose their jobs or be forced to take lower wages to compete with the immigrants. Now, the fact is, most immigrants were not competing with many native-born Americans, at least native-born white Americans, because the jobs that were available to them were usually the more dangerous, lower-paying, less desirable jobs. But they did oftentimes compete with African Americans for that work. By 1882, the Chinese had been completely excluded from the United States. The first American immigration law was the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it forbade any immigration from China at all from that point forward. And anybody who was of Chinese descent could not become an American citizen. This will later be extended to many other East Asians, Japanese, and Koreans, and will cause some problems, particularly for Japanese Americans during World War II. Of course, most immigrants to the United States will adapt to the custom and culture, and this is especially true of their children. What we'll oftentimes see with these waves of immigrants to the United States is that their children, who are often very young when they arrived or were actually born here, have absolutely no problem adapting to American way of life. In addition, America adopted a lot of aspects of these immigrants' culture, their food, their words, music, and other traditions will be brought in and enrich the American culture, because unlike what many people who supported the Americanization movement thought, American culture isn't one particular time and place. It's a mishmash of all of the cultures of all the different groups of people who have come to this country. Individual immigrants will contribute in some pretty notable ways. Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant, but also Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, and Nikola Tesla, who greatly expanded our knowledge of electricity and a lot of other scientific breakthroughs, were both immigrants. Because many immigrants worked in some of the more dangerous and low-paying work in America, a lot of labor leaders such as Samuel Gompers and Mother Jones were also immigrants. In addition, immigrants coming in large numbers means political power, and the votes of immigrants were something that was oftentimes sought after by political parties on both sides. In New York, for example, Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine, organized Irish voters as a bloc, and they could, use the votes of these immigrants to help them to win elections. But the two most important ways immigrants changed America that you're going to want to remember is, number one, they provided the labor source for the booming American economy, both in the factories, but in railroads and mining, and all these other industries could not have gotten along without this big influx of labor. The other thing, and we'll learn more about the cities in the next topic, is many immigrants are going to settle in the cities. As you can see in this picture of Little Italy in New York, somewhere around 1900, their additional population to these cities is going to contribute to the massive growth and boom of the American cities. Take a look at the graphic organizer for this lesson. It's relatively straightforward. Just apply the asked for information into the boxes here. Push factors, pull factors, give me 3 of each. Give me 4 examples of experiences of immigrants. And then at the bottom, what are 3 ways that Americans reacted to immigrants? And what are 3 ways that immigrants contributed to the United States? I filled one in for you here in the experiences of immigrants by noting that many immigrants were often poor and came to the United States with whatever they could carry. All right, good luck. I love you. Bye-bye.